Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our biology class, and in this particular class I'll be teaching cell division, which is a very important topic in biology. But before I proceed, can someone just kindly confirm with me if you guys are able to get me or not? Are you guys able to get me?
We can get you.
All right. Okay. Since you can get me, we can move on and look at what cell division is all about. But before I go in detail, let's look at how do we people grow. Okay, just from there you can think like there is some division that is taking place within us, and these are leading to the growth we are able to see. And we can also think about something like how come we look somehow like our parents. If you check how you look and how your brother looks and how your dad and mom look, you find that you are a little bit similar in certain ways. You might not be similar in terms of phenotype, how you look physically, but there are some traits that you might have inherited from them. Maybe you are a silent guy and you just discover that your dad is also a silent man, or maybe you are business minded. Okay, there are people who are just business minded and you discover that one of their parents are also business minded. Phenotype, you can talk of how you look. Maybe your dad is light in complexion and you are also light in complexion. So all that depend on this branch, which is talking about cell division. So let's quickly look at the introduction, and in this introduction I'll try to explain what cell division is. So basically characteristics of living things are being able to be transferred or passed on from the parents to the offspring, and this normally takes place through the process of reproduction. So the process of reproduction is the one which normally act as the intermediate between the transfer of genetic material from the parents to the daughter cells, or from one generation to another generation. So this genetic information, or the genetic content of every organism, it is being passed on from one organism to another organism through reproduction. But this same reproduction, it depends on a very important process, which is what? Cell division. With that being said, we can move on and say cell division is an important process in all living things. You can talk about human beings, you can talk about animals like dogs, cats, or any other animal or insect like bacteria. Okay, like the bacteria, they normally reproduce, and you find that this cell division, it is very important process in almost all living organisms. So during cell division, one thing you need to understand is that DNA is being replicated. There is a topic specifically on DNA replication, which I'll teach very soon. And cells, they also grow. So a cell will start by growing. So as it grows, it will reach at an extent whereby it has to divide. Okay, all the cells in the human body are able to divide. Okay, except important cells like the nerve cells. Okay, the nerve cells, they normally lose their ability to divide, but they only increase in terms of the number of dendrites, which normally increases, but these cells do not divide. but all the cells in the human body, they're able to divide. Remember, we have two classes of cells. There are cells which are called somatic cells, and there are also cells which are known as gamete cells. So when you talk of somatic cells, these normally do cell division by the process of mitosis. And then when you talk of cells like gamete cells, which are known as sex cells, these normally reproduce by meiosis. So we'll talk about that later on. So this process of cell division is normally classified into two. So we have the one which I just mentioned, which is mitosis, okay? And then during this same cell division, you need to expect the DNA to replicate and also the cell to grow, okay? Now, all these processes which I have stated, all this process of cell division, for it to take place or for a cell to move from one to another product, or let's say for a cell to change from a single cell to two daughter cells like in somatic cells, or four daughter cells like in gamete cells. So for these cells to go to such a period, that whole process is known as the cell cycle, which I'll also explain later on. But one important thing we need to understand that during cell division, these cells normally divide. There is DNA replication, and also there is cell growth. Okay. Now, the sequence of events by which a cell duplicates its genome. So the genome is just the genetic content of a particular cells. All this normally happens through the process which is known as the cell cycle. So the cell cycle, it is just the whole cycle through which a cell undergoes for it to produce two daughter cells or four daughter cells. Like in mitosis, it is two daughter cells, and then in meiosis, it is four daughter cells. So the whole process from a cell being a cell, then that cell will start to grow. After it grows, it's going to divide, it's going to undergo DNA replication, which is at S phase, and then from there it will go and do the mitotic phase, where it's going to divide. So all that process, it is known as what? As the cell cycle. With that being said, I can move on and still on the cell cycle. So a cell cycle has phases. So there are phases of the cell cycle. So basically these phases are being classified into two basic phases. So we have two basic phases of the cell cycle, which is the interphase and also the mitotic phase. So the interphase is the first one, and then we have the M phase, which is the mitosis phase. The interphase, a cell normally grows. So at the interphase here, the cell will normally grow. That's the first thing, and it will also undergo DNA replication at this same phase. So it will undergo growth, and it will also undergo the DNA replication. And then for the mitosis phase, so here the cell will just divide. So at mitosis phase, the cell will just normally divide. One other thing we need to understand is that the interphase is classified into three categories. There are two groups within the interphase. I'll go much in detail later on. So these are the two phases of the cell cycle which we need to understand: the interphase and the M phase. Okay, so with that information, we can look at mitosis specifically. So mitosis, it consists of 4 phases. I think I've already talked about the somatic cells. These somatic cells, they do normally undergo a process of mitosis, and this process of mitosis, it leads to the production of only 2 daughter cells. So this mitosis is divided into 4 phases. We have the prophase, which is the first one, metaphase, anaphase, and then the telophase. So the prophase is the longest. Okay, the prophase is the longest amongst all the phases of mitosis. So the prophase is the longest phase when you talk about all the phases of mitosis. So these are the 4 phases of mitosis that each one of you is supposed to know, and you have to know them in order. We'll talk about mitosis in detail as we move on. Okay, let me go back to the cell cycle and look at the interphase. So the interphase is divided into 3 phases. The interphase is divided into 3 phases. The first phase is the G1 phase, which is also known as the presynthesis. So in the G1 phase, normally the cell will grow. In the G1 phase, normally the cell will grow, and this phase is known as the presynthesis phase, and it can last up to 25 hours. Then the S phase, which is known as the DNA synthesis. So during the S phase, that's when you expect the DNA replication to take place, and it lasts approximately 8 hours. The G2 phase is the post-DNA duplication, and for this phase, it is the last phase of interphase. It's the last phase of interphase, and normally this phase, it lasts from 2.5 hours to 3 hours. So one important thing you need to consider is the one which has the longest period. So the longest period during the interphase, the one you need to understand is the presynthesis phase. So during the presynthesis phase, which is also known as the G1 phase, that's when you expect a lot of time to be spent on this particular phase, followed by the S phase. That's where the DNA replication will take place, and then the G2 phase, which is known as the post-DNA duplication. Okay, so the S phase is characterized by the synthesis of a protein called histone. I think if you study in detail, you talk about histones. Histones are part of the proteins that make up chromosome. Okay, so when we will be talking about chromosome, what chromosome is, we will talk about the special proteins which are known as the histones. So the histones are normally produced during the S phase of interphase. Then during this same S phase, you need to understand that there is replication of DNA and the beginning of duplication of the centrosomes with their centrioles. So most people, when they talk about the S phase, most people and most students, they only know that the S phase is all about replication of DNA. So when their lecturer or professor asks them the phase where duplication of the centrosome with their centrioles, or the phase in which these these guys are being duplicated or replicated, a lot of students, they get it wrong because they only know that it is replication which takes place at S phase, when in the actual sense you have to know that the centrosomes and the centrioles are also duplicated during the S phase. G1 phase, there is an intense synthesis of RNA. One other factor which makes people to fail is because they only know that G1 is the phase where growth takes place. Yes, growth takes place during G1 phase, but if you go in detail, you're going to understand that there is an intense synthesis of RNA and proteins. Okay, so protein synthesis is taking place at G1. There is also the synthesis of histone proteins. Okay, so both at S phase and G1 phase there is synthesis of proteins, but the S phase, it's just giving you the histones. Now when you talk of the G1 phase, it's also able to produce the proteins. Okay, remember last time I said enzymes are proteins. Okay, so these proteins, the ones which act as enzymes during this process, they are produced during what? The G1 phase. So the G1 phase also give us the proteins which play a role in the control of the cell cycle. Okay, then the cell volume is restored to its normal size. So this point is just talking about the growth phase of this same cell. Then one thing that you have to understand is that cells that are not continuously dividing, activity of cell may be temporarily or permanently suspended. So most of the books, or majority of the books, they do not consider the phase which I'm trying to explain on this point. So apart from the G1 and G2 phase, we have a G0 phase. We have a G0 phase. This G0 phase is referred to as the resting phase, and at this particular point the cell normally rests. So some cells like the muscle cells, these cells, they are temporarily suspended, or the cell division is temporarily suspended. But for some cells like the nerve cells, they lose their ability to divide immediately they are formed. Okay, so these guys, they do not divide. So the nerve cells you had when you were born, okay, the nerve cells you had when you were born are the same nerve cells that you have if at all the nerve cells were dividing. You would have been dull, or you would have had knowledge the same way a baby is, because it will be renewing itself. You'll be a new person almost every day. If the nerve cells were dividing, us people would have not been learning new things, would have been illiterate, in short, because these nerve cells, they are there to help us send information to the brain and also to control certain stuffs. And of course, with that being said, that simply means that they are playing a role in memory. Okay, so the nerve cells are permanently suspended. They stop dividing at G0 phase, which most of the books don't talk about. So cells in such states, which are muscle cells, so muscle cells are temporarily suspended, are referred to being in the G0 phase. Okay, so that's what you have to understand at G0 phase. It is normally the resting phase. So this is just the cell cycle diagram. You can find it on the internet, you can find it anywhere. But one thing that you need to get and understand is that the events that takes place during the cycle are: 1, there is growth; 2, DNA replication; 3, segregation of chromosome; and lastly, dividing. I think the hours here, the most important thing is knowing the longest amongst them and the shortest amongst them. So the longest is the G1 and the shortest is the M phase. So when you talk of a cell cycle, it's a very important thing to understand, because once you know the cell cycle, you'll be able to understand the two types of cell division, which are meiosis and mitosis. But in the meantime, I'm just going to explain the cell cycle, and then I'll go and do mitosis and meiosis maybe in my next class. So this is an example of a picture of the cell cycle. So you need to look at some cells just after cytokinesis. Cytokinesis, it is when now the cell divide, okay, the cytoplasm divides. So at G1, the cellular content excluding the chromosome are duplicated. Okay, at G1, the cellular content excluding the chromosomes are duplicated. So in short, the organelles are being duplicated at G1, the growth phase. Then each of the 46 chromosome is duplicated by the cell. So here, that's where DNA replication is expected to take place. Then the cell double checks the duplicated chromosome for error, making any needed repair. So G2, mostly it is all about the growth of the cell. So there is growth of the cell and checking up of the cell. Then lastly, you have mitosis, the mitotic stage, which is divided into the mitosis itself and also the cytokinesis. So cytokinesis, this is when now the cell divides into two. The cytoplasm will divide into two. Then there are some abilities of chiokinesis. When I use the term chiokinesis, I'm just talking about chiokinesis. I'm just talking about the division of the nucleus. So sometimes the division of the nucleus, which takes place by the process of chiokinesis, it normally takes place at G2 phase. So these are the processes and stages of the cell cycle. Remember, there is a G0 phase, which is normally known as the resting phase, and at this phase the cell normally rests. The cell normally rests, and since it's resting, it's not having any cell division. It's not having any cell division. So that is what you have to know about the cell cycle. Okay, so this all cell division is tightly controlled by complexes made of several specific proteins, and this just talking about the enzymes which are being produced during the same cell cycle at G1 phase, like I already explained. So these complexes of enzymes are called cyclin dependent kinases, and these ones, they normally turn on or off the various processes that take place in cell division. Then the same ones, the CDK, they partner with a group of protein which is known as the cyclin. Okay, so that is what you need to know. Then a cell passes through three checkpoints. There are three checkpoints that you need to expect in the cell cycle. The first one is the G1 checkpoint, then you have the G2 checkpoint, and the M speedo checkpoint. All these checkpoints are there to make sure that the cell has correctly replicated, correctly divided, and correctly grown. This is one of the reasons you need to understand that it is very rare to have certain mistakes made by a cell when dividing. There is minimum percentage of a cell to make a mistake as it divides. Why? Because of the presence of these checkpoints. Think that has been explained. So I'll end here because my next objective will be explaining what mitosis is and what meiosis is. But in today's class, I was much interested on the cell cycle. Okay, so cell cycle is a topic on its own, but everything is under cell division and inheritance. So in the meantime, I'll allow you guys to ask questions, and for those who have questions afterwards, you are free to WhatsApp me. And I'll be able to respond.